when is coffee or when does coffee go bad? Or more importantly, how can you tell if your coffee is stale or is it getting stale? Hi, welcome back to Charles Ray's Coffee and Roasters Home Edition. This is in the kitchen of my wife Charnel, the other roaster that's in our company. Let's talk about freshness a little bit. That's one of the most key things when it comes to coffee and drinking a great cup and so forth is the freshness of it. You've seen in retail stores where the coffee has been there for several months. Sometimes I've seen one at a particular retail store where it's been a year, best roast date or best roasted by this date and so forth. It doesn't say that it's not a bad coffee at all or a bad bean. It just proves to show that the stability of this produce is pretty stable. So, for instance, if you have compared to other produce, this one is more stable than the others that are actually on the shelf, according to this book by James Hoffman. Also, whenever you're looking at it, the question is, and what he was talking about is, when is coffee or when does coffee go bad? Or more importantly, how can you tell if your coffee is stale or is it getting stale? And there are really 3 to 4 key things. Number one is the loss of the aroma. So when you open a fresh bag of coffee, you can actually smell, for instance, you can actually smell blueberries, you can smell chocolate, you can smell all these aromas, and it will actually have the description majority of the time of the aromas on the bag. So when you open it, you should be able to smell those type of things. And if you notice throughout the days or throughout the weeks, preferably in one week, you'll smell it, and you will not probably get that blueberry note as like you did the first time you opened the bag. The reasons why is because it's losing the aroma, and that's a sign of it getting stale and so forth. But the beans actually release a lot of aromas as well. So when you go into a retail store, you actually smell coffee. That's because all these coffee bags are releasing nice smells of the coffee aromas and so forth. So the number one way that you can tell your coffee is getting stale is the loss of these aromas or the olfactory sensors, where they are not actually picking up those flavors or those aromas or nuances and so forth. The other aspect is whenever you see a bag, you'll notice that it has different type of notes in it. For instance, I always go to the blueberry, but blueberry, chocolate, nuttiness, earthiness, and things like that. So those are complex flavors that you're wanting to taste. So that development time within it is going to mix in all together to make it taste more like a average coffee and not the special coffee that you actually have when you first open up the bag. It's kind of like whenever you are having this great, awesome leftover dinner. You know, all those flavors are mixed in, but then on the third day, it doesn't really taste like it did on the second day and so forth. So the other part of it is the development time inside that bag with all those beans mixing in together with those nuances or those certain flavors. The other way that you can tell is the beans produce some of these oils or these lipids and so forth. And when they produce these oils and lipids, it starts getting this rancid smell. Not saying that it's a bad smell, but it's not really appealing to someone that just opened up their bag about a week or two ago. And the reasons why is because these oils are starting to come up, and you'll see the beans starting to be a little more oily and so forth. And this is really particular with dark roast. Dark roast, they produce more of that uh, oily bean as well. The other aspect of if your coffee is becoming stale is the degassing aspect. So every bag will have a valve on it, kind of like this. It'll have a valve, and this valve allows, it's called a degassing valve. It allows carbon dioxide, CO2, to actually escape the beans, the bag, so that the beans can remain fresh as much as possible. If you hear if you hear someone drinking water, that's our French bulldog Titus. You know, he's running around and things like that. I keep trying to get him to pay attention to me while I'm talking, but he's wanting to do his own thing. So I apologize about that. But when it comes to degassing, you know, it's degassing that carbon dioxide or that CO2. And that CO2 is released, and it's important for it to release as well. And so whenever we roast, that's one of the byproducts of a great roast, is that development of that CO2, and it's leaving the actual coffee bean and so forth. And you can really tell, particularly whenever you're doing an espresso shot or you're doing an actual pour over. On the pour over, what you'll see later on, whenever we start looking at different brew methods, you'll have a release of that carbon dioxide in the blooming phase. When it puffs up and things like that, that's pretty much that carbon dioxide releasing whenever the hot water touches the beans. Whenever you're doing an espresso, that crema that's on that espresso is actually the carbon dioxide that's releasing from that bean when the hot water actually touches the bean. So whenever you have things like that, it's good to know that it's a really good coffee that you have. The freshness is there. But also, believe it or not, the coffee can be too fresh as well. So whenever it's too fresh, that means that the carbon dioxide, the crema, is overpowering and it's way too much, or the blooming actually goes over the pour over and so forth. But also, when you're looking at these bags and when you're looking at what is that freshness like, remember, it's those three things. It's those four things. You know, what is the your olfactory senses telling you? You know, what can you smell it? Is it the same smell that you had the first time? You know, and just thinking about the demand of that bean and the development. All those things are being mixed in. You know, the bean is so intriguing that it can touch something and then it'll end up kind of taking the flavors of that other thing. We'll talk about the storage of beans and the side effect or the downside of keeping them in the refrigerator, because the bean is like a sponge and so forth. The other aspect is just that rancid smell on it because of those lipids and those fats and things like that that are on the bean, and the degassing aspect. So whenever you're looking at the freshness, what is fresh? So whenever we roast, we usually tell people to allow it to degas 3 to 4 days. Uh, and 7 days is really a great time for it to kind of release what the carbon dioxide is needed to release so that you can have a really enjoyable cup of coffee. Interesting to know also with our Yergachefe bean from Ethiopia, this bean actually is really at its peak around the 12th or 14th day. That's when you'll actually have that blueberry note and so forth. But give it about a week. You know, I think Mr. Hoffman says, you know, for espressos, it's about 3 or 4 days. And then with pour overs, I think it's 5 to 7 days. I could have that reversed as well, so I'm not for sure. But it's one of those, give it about a week after a roast date. So whenever you go to a retail store, or we highly recommend you going to local coffee shops, because you're supporting local, you're probably supporting a local roaster as well that's providing those coffee beans. Look and see when it was roasted. They'll probably have that roast date on there and not best brewed by. They'll probably have a roast date on there so that you'll know that it's probably in its prime to go ahead and enjoy. hopefully you got really good advice from that. Like I said, we're going through this book, and the first part of the book was talking about how can you tell if your coffee is losing its flavor, is becoming stale, and how long is freshness. Stay tuned for the next episode and stay tuned for the next chapter that we're going to discuss in this book. Stay with us. And also, what we're going to try to challenge you to do in going through that best coffee that you can make is leaving away the cream and sugars and trying to figure out what is your taste. Is it a light roast? Is it a dark roast, medium roast? Do you like the acidity or do you like the bold, chocolatey, more of a bitterness taste in your coffee? Don't go anywhere. Just stay with us.